2019 marks the 100-year anniversary of the March 1st independence movement, as well as the establishment of Korea's provisional government. To reflect on this important milestone in Korea's history, an international forum was held in Seoul, and one of the keynote speakers was Professor Bruce Cumings, a distinguished historian who has authored several highly regarded books on modern Korean history and was even given a presidential award by the late Kim Dae-jung for his work. We're honoured to say that he joins us in the studio today. Professor Cumings, thank you for making the time to speak to us.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start with that forum you were here for and your keynote speech, because it's got quite an interesting title, A Unique Colony, Korea, Last to be Colonized and First to Revolt. Can you tell us a bit more about your keynote speech and what you wanted to talk about there?
Well, there were two characteristics of the Japanese annexation of Korea that seemed to me very important. One is how late it was in world time. The Portuguese started colonizing various places in the world 400 years before the March 1st movement or the Japanese annexation. So Japan entered the colonial world, so to speak, with Korea, while people were already talking about anti-colonial movements and anti-colonial rhetoric, especially in the United Kingdom and the U.S. Woodrow Wilson, the president of the U.S., brought up his 14 points a few years after Korea was colonized, calling for self-determination for all nations. And so there's that timing that got the Japanese into a lot of trouble, because before they know it, they're subject to a major uprising in Korea in 1919, which drew upon many of these new ideas, including Wilson's ideas. And I don't think that's been pointed out often enough about Korea. And then, of course, Koreans were very early to revolt against colonialism. Egypt and, of course, Ireland, which had all kinds of trouble with England at the end of World War I, also had uprisings. But Korea's not only was very early and anticipated just a world of uprisings after World War II, but it was basically pacifist. It was nonviolent. India also had a nonviolent movement under Gandhi, but just in its very early stages. So you really have to hand it to the leaders of the March 1st movement. They were intellectuals who didn't start throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails or whatever.
Yeah.
I guess they didn't have Molotov cocktails. They had something else bad.
Are you saying that says something about Korean people's character, would you say, or at least at that time anyway?
Well, I think it says something about, well, it says two things. One is that Korea was not some barren land full of tribes that had never gotten together, but had the prerequisites of a nation for hundreds of years before the Japanese annexed Korea. And so the annexation had the quality not so much of a colonial power carving out a new space in Africa or the Middle East and calling it Iraq, but more of an invasion, an aggression against Korea. And that also speaks well of the organizers of March 1st, that they didn't respond with violence to the Japanese violence. But I think the most important thread there is a strong Korean civil society that was developing, a middle class, an intellectual group, scholar officials and so on, that tried to call the world's attentions to Japanese depredations in the best way possible. And I think you can draw a thread from that all the way to the candlelight processions of the last 20 years.
That's what I wanted to ask. So, how would you evaluate the past 100 years since then, how Korean society has developed?
Well, I've been around for quite a few of those 100 years, and I often think there's almost no other country in the world that's gone through the changes and the ups and downs and the violence that Korea has gone through. It didn't really start with the March 1st movement. It started with the Weebyung resisting the Japanese, so-called righteous army, in the first decade of the 20th century, and then it continued through the colonial period, which was immensely disruptive of Korea. One of the points I made in response to a question this morning was, why do the Taiwanese seem to be nostalgic for the Japanese, whereas the Koreans hate them? And there were 35,000 Taiwanese in Japan in 1945 at the end of World War II. 2.5 million Koreans there, another million in Manchuria. Koreans were just the human capital that the Japanese used to move millions of people into, factories, mine work, 200,000 in the army. And that's all before the division of Korea, the Korean War, where millions of people died, maybe 4 million. And then 70 years of division with the chance of a new war ever since.
Yes, of course. I mean, I wanted to get your thoughts on that situation with North Korea currently, because, despite everything South Korea has gone through, as you said, the Korean Peninsula does still remain divided. But over the last year, we've seen quite some unprecedented developments changing. And you've said in another interview that you have trouble appreciating the suddenness of it all, especially as you've been covering Korean history for many years now. Do you still feel that way? Are you still reeling, perhaps?
Well, I wanted to add one more point to what I was just talking about, and that is I just drove, for half an hour through Seoul, and the development of Seoul and of South Korea more generally is just really also a remarkable story of the last 100 years. I don't know who would have predicted it from the standpoint of 1910, but it's just a terribly impressive achievement on the part of the Korean people. I guess I've been amazed by a lot of things that have happened ever since Donald Trump was elected. He's the most volatile and unpredictable president we've ever had. But so far, his influence on the Korean Peninsula has been good. I evaluate him a lot higher than most of my friends who were anti-Trump people to the core. I think he doesn't get credit for what he's done because so many people can't stand him, particularly in the intellectual class. But
I mean, you've been studying Korean history for a long time, and these recent developments. Do you still get surprised by things that happen on the Korean Peninsula affairs, especially now with, as you said, this factor with Donald Trump and the American president?
Well, the fact is, most of what's happened in the last 75 years has been very predictable because of the confrontation between North and South. And sometimes it seems nothing ever changes. You get progress with Kim Dae-jung and Clinton, and then you get regress with Bush and Lee Myung-bak and so on. Trump is very different. He looks at Korea with, I said, innocent eyes in one interview. There's nothing innocent about Trump, but he doesn't really know the history. But he wants to make an impact. He doesn't like the foreign policy establishment and what it thinks about Korea. If you take just one example, it's a minor example where he called American war games. First of all, he called them war games, which he's not supposed to. But second of all, he called them provocative. And the whole foreign policy establishment in Washington was up in arms. In fact, they've been terribly provocative for decades. And they're some of the largest war games in the world.
That's the rhetoric, North Korea used, but obviously Washington and South Korea were trying to avoid.
Well, the question is, are they provocative or not, regardless of what North Korea says? And I've always thought they were provocative. What small country wants the greatest power on earth having huge war games just across its border in a situation that's already volatile? So that's a small example of Trump just not being willing to read out of the Bible of the Washington insiders. As a result, progress is being made. The North Koreans are not testing missiles and bombs, and Trump has not renewed these big war games, not to mention all the things that President Moon Jae-in has been doing to lessen tensions. So I'm quite I'm not happy with what happened in Hanoi. That was unfortunate, but
Yes.
I do think there's been a lot of progress.
Yes, so there was a lot of progress, as you said, but as you said, Hanoi didn't quite go as well as we might have hoped. I mean, especially you. I mean, you've covered the Korean War quite a lot. I mean, you're perhaps you're best known for your work on the Korean War, and there was hope perhaps towards ending the war with a declaration, with an official declaration. But that didn't happen. Do you think it will happen, or what are your hopes towards that?
I think it's one of the easiest pieces of low-hanging fruit, really, that Trump and Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in can do, maybe with the Chinese too. It's already become clear that they don't want a peace treaty because that would have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, but some sort of a peace agreement calling a final end to the Korean War.
Why is that important?
Well, there's only an armistice holding the peace, and every few years, going back to 1953, there have been incidents that could easily escalate into a new war. But to me, what's important about it is it's very important to the North Koreans, and it's a small measure to take on the part of the United States or South Korea, and therefore, like I said, it's maybe the easiest part of this equation.
It's the easiest, but without denuclearization, though, that's the key word. I think really, the Trump administration have been stressing that North Korea needs to take steps. Without doing significant steps towards denuclearization, will we see it though?
Well, 90% of the foreign policy establishment says that North Korea has done nothing since Singapore. Trump points out that they're not testing their missiles and bombs, and he's right about that. I mean, it's very important that North Korea quit testing in November 2017, right at the point where they had shown that they had nuclear weapons, and they had shown they had an intercontinental ballistic missile with an 8,000-mile range. But they had not demonstrated to themselves or to the world that they could put a nuclear warhead on a missile like that, and particularly, not just fire it off, but bring it down through the atmosphere without it burning up. So I think that was entirely calculated on the part of North Korea. It was just before a month when Trump seriously considered attacking North Korea with the so-called Bloody Nose preemptive attack in December of 2017. And so it was a big concession by the North Koreans, and Trump recognizes the significance of it. It's not to be sniffed at. Really, all hell would break loose if they started testing again, so you see why it's important.
It's been a month since the Hanoi summit, but there's been very little progress made since then, considering, especially over the last year and a half, we've seen so much development. So we seem to be at a bit of a standstill. But then who needs to make the move first now?
Well, I think Trump needs to sort out his advisors, particularly Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, because it looks quite clear that the deal that was supposed to be signed in Hanoi was nixed after Trump got a load of what Bolton and Pompeo have to say. And this is a very dangerous situation because Bolton and Pompeo have been on record, Bolton for more than 20 years, at saying the real answer to the North Korean problem is to get rid of the North Korean regime. And so I don't see how Trump can go forward with a third summit or some kind of deal with North Korea until he gets his advisors on board.
Let's go back to the to South Korea. I mean, South Korea will be continuing to push for Kim Jong-un's visit to Seoul, and I just want to ask: can you see that happening? And is that what you wish for South Korea going ahead?
I think every time the two leaders of the Koreas meet, it's a good idea, and I think for Kim Jong-un, who allegedly has switched from his military first and nuclear policies to wanting to build up the North Korean economy, it'd be good for him to get a good look at Seoul and what I was talking about earlier, just the immense development here. North Korea, if it wants to get off the mark economically and develop. It needs every kind of help from South Korea. So for that reason alone, I think it's very important. I mean, Moon Jae-in has the core of his engagement policy with North Korea is economic, to open export zones and bring North Korea out of its isolation and slowly rebuild the North Korean economy bit by bit. So, I think it would be excellent if he came here.
Do the events of the last 15 months give you hope of a unified Korea? Is that what you would, what you hope for, basically, going ahead?
Well, I used to tell people that I was sure the Koreas would be united in my lifetime, but now I'm getting down to a few decades, hopefully, if I'm lucky. And I don't know if it'll happen then, because the unification policy that Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, and Moon Jae-in are pursuing is really a reconciliation policy over decades that would allow North Korea to come out of its shell and for Koreans to get to know each other again. And so I think what we're seeing now is the deepest reconciliation ever. But I think reunification is still quite a ways off.
You've been recognized for your work in South Korea on Korean history. What does it mean for you to have that kind of recognition? And going forward, what are your plans now?
Well, today in 2019, it's deeply gratifying to me. However, my first work, The Origins of the Korean War, in 1984 was banned by the Chunduan dictatorship, and it was a bit of a reception I hadn't quite anticipated. I actually met today for the first time with the 91-year-old translator into Korean of my first book.
Wow.
It was done off the books, so to speak, because Korea hadn't signed the copyright convention. So I think he didn't want to meet me until he was sure I wouldn't be mad at him. But we had a very nice chat. But he said he was visited by the police several times, but because his grandfather, his father, and he himself were resistance fighters against the Japanese, they never jailed him. But that was the first reception of my book. But it's strange because in the U.S. the reception was very different. My first book won the biggest award that was available to it from Historians Association. But I just thought I was right because I was reading primary documents, formerly highly secret, that people hadn't seen, and that sooner or later people would come around to my views. And not the whole country, but certainly a lot of people have done that, so it's very gratifying.
I think we'll end the interview there. I mean, Professor Bruce Cumings, it's been very enlightening to speak to you today. Thank you for coming in, and we hope you can talk to you again next time as well.
Great. Thank you very much.